Welcome to Doing the Work, a Naples Integrated Recovery podcast. My name is Brian, and this space is for anyone who's tired of surviving the same emotional and behavioral loops, whether that's anxiety, trauma, addiction, or problems in your relationships. Around here, we cut the surface level advice and sugarcoating, no platitudes or bumper sticker wisdom. We focus on clarity, responsibility, emotional discipline, and the courage to look at yourself honestly so that you can stop repeating old patterns and start living with intention instead of reaction. Let's get into it. Today's episode may not be for everybody, but if you struggle with addiction, or if you know anybody with addiction, or if you are a professional who might be working with other people with addiction, then this one may be for you. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about addiction is the idea that people are using or drinking because it feels good. And that story survives because it sounds obvious. People drink alcohol because it is pleasurable, or that they use drugs because it can create pleasure, or because they like it. And sometimes that is the case. I've had some clients that I have worked with that have said, I had a perfect childhood. I have lots of friends in school. My parents are rich. I've never wanted for anything. I just really love being effed up. And so that makes sense. But for anyone who has ever really lived in addiction or treated it long enough, knows how shallow that explanation is, because if pleasure was the point, people would stop long before addiction takes hold. Pleasure fades quickly, and what remains is compulsion, repetition, and a persistence even when the experience itself is flat, numbing, or actively unpleasant. That's not a paradox. It is a clue that addiction doesn't organize around pleasure, it organizes around movement. Neuroscience makes this clearer than moral frameworks do, because the dopamine system, the one that is often mislabeled as the pleasure chemical, is not primarily about enjoyment, it's about seeking, about forward motion, about anticipation, pursuit, and the sense that something in the environment is worth moving toward. Pleasure is a downstream event, but the seeking is the engine. And if your seeking system is healthy, then life pulls forward in quiet, ordinary ways. Curiosity registers, effort feels justified, and the future has texture. You don't have to talk yourself into engagement because the engagement just happens automatically. If that system collapses, the world doesn't feel painful, it feels inert. And this is the condition that most people miss. Addiction doesn't start because someone feels so much pleasure. It starts because nothing is pulling them. There's no signal, no draw, no reason to move, and the brain can't tolerate that state for very long. A nervous system without seeking will manufacture seeking. If it can't find motivation organically, it will accept a synthetic signal. Drugs don't create something foreign. They temporarily restore a function that has gone offline. And that is why people with early drug use or alcohol use, it can feel stabilizing. Not necessarily euphoric, but stabilizing. The person doesn't say, I feel amazing. They instead feel like, I can finally breathe, or I finally feel relief, because their anxiety quiets, their depression lifts just enough, and their focus feels like it returns. So the future stops feeling like a tomb that they're stuck inside. And that is not pleasure seeking, that's survival. That's where a lot of people with addictions find themselves. This is also why the pleasure model collapses under scrutiny, because people can continue using long after pleasure disappears. That was certainly the case for me. They use it even though it ruins relationships, careers, health, self-respect. They use even though it makes them feel worse. And there's absolutely no pleasure-based theory that can explain that. But a seeking-based theory absolutely does. Once the brain learns that a substance reliably restores movement, even if it's only briefly, it tags it as essential. So we're talking about a sick brain. And over time, the system reorganizes around that shortcut. Natural sources of seeking lose their potency. The new artificial signal becomes dominant, and the person is not chasing pleasure anymore. They are chasing relief from inertia. And now, here's where moral language does some real damage. If addiction is framed as pleasure-seeking, then continued use gets interpreted as self-indulgent, weak, or selfish, or a failure of character rather than a failure of capacity. And that kind of framing invites shame, pressure, and punishment. When addiction is instead understood as an attempt to restore a collapsed motivational system, the behavior doesn't become acceptable, but it becomes intelligible. What looks like indulgence is truly revealed to be compensation, and what looks like defiance is really revealed as survival. This behavior remains harmful, but it finally makes sense, and that distinction matters because it determines where intervention belongs. If addiction was about pleasure itself, then abstinence would probably solve most of it, but it doesn't. For a lot of people, the most destabilizing period is after they stop. Now the substance is gone, and nothing replaces the function that it was serving. Seeking doesn't rebound immediately. Often it drops even further. So this is the phase where people describe feeling empty, flat, restless, anxious, panicked, and they aren't craving the substance itself. Well, if you have acute detox, you will be. So I am not recommending that anybody just cuts anything out cold turkey. In fact, a medically supervised detox for many substances is advisable. Seek a consultation, go see a professional. Don't just stop something cold turkey by yourself, especially if it comes with health risks. But assuming you are past the acute withdrawal period of ending whatever your substance use is, these people are not craving the substance itself as much as they are craving the movement that has always been associated with that. And so I have seen many people in peer-led programs who were abstinent for months or maybe even years, but the brain is always on this fast forward, like, okay, so we're all going to the aquarium, and then after that, then what are we going to do next? 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 And that's something to chase. That's something to organize the day around. Something creates forward momentum. This is also where a lot of treatment unintentionally misfires. So behavior stops, and then some people think that success is declared, but internally, the system is potentially even worse off because the artificial source of seeking has been removed, and now nothing has built around it to replace what that was. The person is sober but inert. And from the outside, this might look like resistance or unwillingness, and on the inside, it feels like paralysis. And then the wrong pressure might get applied. People are told to want recovery more, to find meaning, get honest, sit with discomfort, work harder, be more surrendered, be more grateful, take more responsibility, push through. And none of those restore seeking. They add demand to a system that is already struggling to initiate. They assume capacity that isn't even there, and they are confusing moral readiness with neurological readiness. This is why relapse often follows periods of doing, quote-unquote, everything right. The person isn't failing to comply. They have exhausted themselves while trying to operate without a functional engine. It's also why addiction often coexists with depression. Not sadness, real depression, a mood state where the future doesn't register as worth moving toward, where effort costs more than return, or where choice exists in theory but not in the body. And in that state, substances aren't tempting because they're fun, they're tempting because they work. Briefly, unreliably, and at a cost, but they work for a little bit. I'm not excusing behavior, I'm explaining persistence. And this is also where shame accelerates the cycle. When the person believes that they are using because they're weak, or they have someone telling them that it's pleasure-driven or a moral failure, now you're adding self-attack to an already depleted system. Shame further suppresses seeking. Isolation deepens it, and then the substance becomes even more necessary. At this point, addiction is no longer about the drug, it's about a system that doesn't know how to move without it. So, stopping behavior is necessary, but stopping alone doesn't restore function. Without rebuilding the seeking system, abstinence becomes containment, not recovery, and containment has a shelf life. Once you understand that addiction is not about pleasure, but about seeking, the central question shifts. The question is no longer, how do I stop this behavior, but instead, what conditions allow seeking to come back online? That is a very different problem. Seeking doesn't respond to pressure, it responds to capacity. It requires a nervous system that isn't overwhelmed, sleep-deprived, inflamed, chronically stressed, or living under constant threat, whether that's internal or external. It requires rhythm, predictability, safety, repetition, time. And it also requires opportunities for movement that don't immediately punish effort. This is where many recovery models struggle. They emphasize moral transformation before neurological stabilization, and they are asking for meaning before the system can even register reward. They are demanding honesty and shaming somebody for their inability to be honest. They are asking for vulnerability and sustained effort from people whose motivational circuits are barely even firing. And when those efforts fail, the conclusion is, oh, you're just not ready, or keep coming back, or some snarky thing like that. And a more accurate conclusion is that the system isn't resourced. Recovery isn't about becoming virtuous enough to stop using. It's about rebuilding a life that generates enough natural pull that substances lose their monopoly on movement. That takes a lot longer than detox, longer than early sobriety or chasing what is referred to as the pink cloud, and longer than a lot of people want to admit. And it also doesn't look dramatic. Seeking just returns quietly. Interest flickers. Energy comes back unevenly. and the future becomes imaginable before it even becomes desirable. This is why people often relapse right before things might start to improve. Now, one thing I did hear a lot in my early days that was really helpful was, don't give up before the miracle happens. And I clung to that because I didn't believe a miracle was possible. I didn't think that my system would ever come back online. I thought I was going to be broken forever. But the hope of other people gave me enough inspiration that maybe if they did it, possibly it could happen for me too. But I'm talking about a system that is very fragile, and the artificial signal, whether that's alcohol, THC, whatever that thing is, in the sick person's brain feels more reliable than an organic reward. And one spike, one F up, can reset the whole baseline. Understanding this doesn't mean that relapse is acceptable. It means that it makes sense. And it means that it's probably a likely part of the process for most people. And what allows for effective intervention instead of punishment is that we have to understand the system first. Recovery lives in restoring capacity, biological, psychological, relational, before demanding sustained output. And it lives in creating conditions where effort starts paying off again, even if it's only modest. So it lives in treating addiction as a disorder of movement, not morality. When seeking comes back online, behavior changes follow pretty naturally, not because someone's trying harder, but because life starts pulling again. And when that happens, the substance stops feeling like freedom, just feels unnecessary. For me, this isn't theoretical. I don't fight addiction. I don't white knuckle. I don't manage cravings. I don't negotiate with urges. Alcohol is not something that I resist or avoid. It's just something that I don't even think about at all. Not because I'm, fighting with restraint every day, but because it feels unnecessary. It has no pull, no relevance, no signal. And that absence isn't fragile, and it's not hard won in the moment. It's just stable. It's quiet. It is a byproduct of a system that no longer needs artificial movement to feel engaged with life. Now, this does not mean that I am not in long-term recovery. Some people in 12-step programs really bristle at the idea that I don't call myself an alcoholic anymore, like that's ego driving, and, I don't center myself around an identity of alcoholism or abstinence. But recovery, at least as I understand it now, it isn't about constant vigilance and constantly living in fear of relapse. It's about restored function, that the seeking system came back online for normal, healthy things. Energy returned, direction returned, life started pulling again. And when that happens, substances don't need to be fought. They simply stop offering anything useful. That is the distinction that some models miss. The goal isn't a lifetime of saying no to drugs or alcohol. The goal is to build a life where there's nothing compelling to say no to. It's just not a thought. When motivation is restored and the system is no longer collapsed, addiction doesn't have to be managed as a central concern, just fades in the background, not through effort, not through denial, but just because it no longer serves a purpose. That isn't relapse denial or arrogance. It's what recovery really looks like when the machinery is repaired, and that is a result of doing the work. Thanks for spending the time with me. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with somebody who may need to hear it. Be kind to yourself, be kind to others around you. Remember that we're all doing the best that we can with the tools that we currently have, and we are all capable of growing past them. If you'd like to reach out or connect, send me an email, brian@naplesintegratedrecovery.com. I hope to hear from you there. And in the meantime, thanks again for listening, and I'll see you on the next one.